So just prior to my NDE, I want to give a little context. I was drinking quite heavily for several years at that point. I was basically medicating myself, not really understanding why I was drinking myself into oblivion night after night, just because it was so familiar to me to be in that kind of unwell mindset, right? And it had got to the point where one morning, the morning of the NDE, I woke up with the same frazzled thinking, like, what happened last night? Did I go anywhere? Is anybody else in my condo with me? Like, it was just insane. So anyways, that was all my normal. And then what was completely abnormal was the fact that I had this massive amount of pain shooting from my collarbone down my chest, all the way down to my waist. And so I made it down the stairs to my couch, and I sat down on my couch, and I was so unwell at the time mentally that I thought to myself, well, if I just take a few swigs of the schnapps sitting next to me on the couch, this pain's going to go away. And so that's what I did. I took a few good swigs of it, but literally in the same second, it all just came back up all over me. And so the second I went to get a cloth to clean myself up, so I went to stand up, I felt like I was cemented back down onto my couch. And that's where the pain all of a sudden felt like pressure. Like it felt like there was about 300 pounds now sitting on my chest. And I remember looking over to the right where my cell phone was sitting on my couch and thinking, like to go get my cell phone, but I couldn't move. Like that's how it was paralyzing. And at that moment, I thought to myself, I'm having a heart attack. And it seemed like almost the exact same time I thought that, I heard a voice say, yeah, and that's okay. And in that moment, that's when I felt a huge release, just a complete letting go, surrendering, and everything in my condo as I knew it went white. And that meant my body, that meant the buildings, that meant the whole street block, that meant everything. And so in that moment, I was literally in this vast white. And it almost, I want to say it felt like, but I didn't have a body. Like I didn't have eyes to look through, and I didn't have ears to hear, and I didn't have hands to touch something, but it was in me. Like I was the whiteout, or it was me. Like I could feel it, its aliveness. And there was two voices that spoke to me in the whiteout. So they didn't have bodies either. It was just voices. And one was a man's voice and one was a woman's voice. And which I later realized, like in that moment, I knew it was God. But it wasn't until years later that I understood them to be divine masculine energy and divine feminine energy unified. So like as one. So another word for God could be union, in the way that I see it anyways. So when those two voices spoke to me, there was just this complete peace. And the best way I can describe the feeling of being in the whiteout and being with these voices, even though they were one, was a completeness. Like I actually felt complete. And prior to that, I didn't feel complete. I felt very fragmented. I felt very messed up. Obviously, that's why I'd been knocking myself out with alcohol for so many years, because the pain was so bad. So in that moment, everything was complete. And the voices showed me, even though I didn't have eyes, the concerns that basically my immediate family were having about me for a long time at that point, because I was killing myself with alcohol. And so to me, when they'd act concerned, it was like, what's the problem? Like everything's cool, chill out. And but in that moment, I could not just see their concerns, I could feel them. Like everything was moving through me as if it was my own. And so just prior to coming out of it, they gave me the option. Do I want to stay? Do I want to go back? And I remember, and it wasn't in a threatening way or anything like that. It was a very loving way that they said it. But they also let me know that this was the last time they were helping me out of this particular situation, like with the alcohol. And so I wanted to go back. And I, like I said, felt very at peace, very complete. And what's interesting is I don't remember coming back. Like I don't, there's a moment where I remember calling somebody that was really not good for me in my life at that time. I remember calling them and saying, you need to come over today, because I needed to talk with that person and tell them they couldn't be in my life anymore. I couldn't be in their life anymore, because we were not good for one another. And now that my thinking had shifted or my vibration had shifted, we just were no longer a match. And so that was the moment I remembered. Now, I don't know if that was days later or the week later. That's how unplugged I am from coming out of it. And maybe that stuff will come back sometime, I don't know, but it's never surfaced. And this happened in 2005. So that gap of coming out of the whiteout has never resurfaced from that. And one thing I want to mention as well is after the whiteout, I never went to the hospital. I don't know for sure if I had a heart attack, because I never went to the hospital to see a doctor to find that out. But one thing that happened after the whiteout that I became aware of more over time was how the right side of my face drooped more than the left side. And I was aware of it, but not as aware of it as I became when I went to see an acupuncturist a few years later. Now, when I went to see this acupuncturist, I ended up going to see him once a week, every week for almost a year, because he would put the needles everywhere, but then he would hook these little electrode things up to it and then turn on this machine because it would help stimulate the electrodes going into the acupuncture needles. So it would just accelerate things. And anyways, and he said that when he would do anything on the right side of my face, nothing was registering. And he's like, that's weird. He's like, usually that would indicate a stroke. And I thought, oh my, so in that moment, I became, yes, that is possibly what happened. A heart attack, a stroke. And then it all started really making sense. It was like the confirmation started coming in. And that's when I started going to see him once a week, every week, so he could start to stimulate these muscles more in my face, because it was not just the mouth, but everything pulled down a bit on that side, to which over time, with a lot of work on that side, the muscles started to regenerate, but they're still not the same as the left side of my face. So that to me was the confirmation that I had a heart attack and or stroke, but it didn't come until years later. But I knew anyways, in that moment, seconds before I went into the whiteout, when I said to myself, I'm having a heart attack, it was a knowing, I knew it. Just like when I heard the words, yeah, and that's okay, and I surrendered, it was just this innate knowing. And also what was interesting is I've watched other NDE shows before and listened to people tell their experiences about going into a white light. And there's always a tunnel. And there's sort of some way to get there, like a wormhole. And that wasn't my experience at all. It was the second I heard those words, yeah, and it's okay, and I surrendered and let go, the whiteout just happened. I didn't travel anywhere to get to anything. And I believe that's because I fully surrendered. And when you fully surrender and let go, time collapses. Like the construct of the mind is time. And that collapses, and we're amidst the timeless. And that's why I was with God. And that's why I was in that state of oneness with God and everybody's concerns. Like I was everything. at once for that full surrendered moment that I'll never forget for the rest of my life. And so my life began to dramatically change after that point, and starting with that one guy that I called up, because prior to that, I would go out with this particular person and I'd never remember what happened when I got home. So who knows what was happening when I was going out? Like, I was so unwell at the time, so I was hanging out with very unwell people, right? The birds of a feather flock together. So we were of the same loin at that point. So there was definitely friends that started to shift out of my life that I was no longer talking to, and new ones that were coming in. And then I became drawn to doing things like meditation, even though I'd never been taught how to meditate. I would just sit in moments of silence, listening to the inside, to the outside, just becoming aware of everything, being in blissful states of peace. And whether it was in my house or whether I was outside just staring at the sky or sitting by the river, it was just constant moments of bliss. And so during that time, I also began knowing things about people. So some people would say that's psychic. So I just call them knowings. So I wasn't looking for anything, but I'd be around certain friends and pick up on things and know things. Like, I remember this one guy I was dating at the time said to me, yeah, my roommate started dating this girl and he wants to know if she's the one. And I said to him, oh, he'll know she's the one if she shows up at his door tonight with yellow roses. And no doubt she showed up at his house that night with a bouquet of yellow roses. Like, number one, how many women bring guys flowers on their first date? And the fact that they were yellow. So it was very random things like that. They would just kind of come out of nowhere. And then there were the more, I guess, supernatural, for lack of a better word, things that were happening. I wrote in my book, Soul Center, in one of the chapters, I had an experience with this guy I named John, just to respect his identity. And I ran into him in the gym. I never knew him, but I'd always seen him in the gym. And he came up to me and we had a conversation and at the end of it, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, it was really nice to meet you, and walked away. Now, I just recently found out that touch is something called clairtaction. So we can download information from touching objects or somebody touching us, which it's interesting how all these pieces are coming together over the years. But anyways, and so I went home that night, didn't think anything else other of our interaction. And I had a lucid dream about this kid, where I say kid, but he was my age at the time, where I knew I found out all these personal details about him that I would have never known. And when I spoke with him after this, he was baffled. Like, how could you have known that? These are things that are extremely personal that my immediate family only knew about. And that really took us on a healing journey together that healed a lot of stuff in me too, and in him. And I guess you could call that sort of my first client as to what I do today, which is called perception facilitation. But that was in 2005, and there was a big gap in between there, because I've been doing perception facilitation now for about 7.5 years. So in between that time, there are a lot of ups and downs. At the end of that year with the whiteout, it didn't sustain itself in that same blissful way that I had. I actually came crashing down and went into a depression, experienced a lot of anxiety, a lot of ups and downs. But because I had the foundation, so to speak, of the whiteout, it gave me the ability to keep pursuing through that, which led me on a massive journey where I went around the entire world, hiring people that I found interesting to try out their modalities on me to help me heal, and also expose my own inner knowings and lead me to what I'm doing today. So when I work with clients today, it's different. I don't go into a lucid dream like I did with John and merge with them and have them tell me everything, although that can very randomly happen and is not something that I can control, even though I wish I could kind of control that. That would be nice and it would help me more. It's more of instinctually knowing. So I'll have clients that'll come to me for autoimmune disease order, for grief, for anxiety is the biggest one that I work on. I work on digestion issues. I mean, you name it. And people come to me with their physical and emotional programs. And when I say program, I'm just meaning a belief pattern. And so what I do is I meditate on my clients in the morning and in the evenings in the cellular memory of the whiteout. So I can't go back to the whiteout, like the whiteout's not happening again, but it is the memory of it. So when I meditate in that vast space and I focus in on the programmings that they're wanting to change and move away from, there's an alchemization process where I act as a conduit to come in and stall or put on pause that emotional and or physical program. And then the person's body repairs or heals itself. And so this process is essentially rewiring neural pathways and neural networks in the brain. So anxiety, for example, when it's operating a person, right, that is their normal. That's the path, so to speak, that they're carving out in their brain day in and day out. Anxiety, anxiety, anxiety. So when that program stalled, now their brain, their thinking begins to shift, which then means it becomes a physical reality. So now the brain literally has to start to carve out a new neural pathway, a new train of thought that is then going to become their new familiar, to how they can live more optimally without those programs operating them, so to speak. And during this time as well, over the last, I'd say 7.5 to 8 years, I began writing manuscripts. And I finally published one just last year in October. No, sorry, just this year. and or no, because that would be 2022. So in 2022, I published a book called Soul Center. And I don't go into a lot of detail in that book about what I do with clients today. I do mention the NDE experience at the beginning of the book, but I don't call it an NDE. I call it an epiphany. And I find that that's because oftentimes we can dress things up in a way, or let's say a person could watch somebody talking about their NDE experience, and in their mind, they're dressing it up to be this big event that they would have to go through also in order to attain some sort of peace in their life, or maybe some abilities. And I just don't think that we all have to go through trauma and or have a near-death experience to have moments of clarity, to have epiphanies that can align us to our instinct and connect us with our own God source energy. And then we can just see life clearly and differently. And so when I wrote the book Soul Center, I wrote it with that in mind, almost like a manuscript, or sorry, almost like a, what's the word that I'm looking for? A manual. So I wrote it like a manual to give my clients at first, so that I wanted them to have something in their hands where they could also access their own potential from within. And the way that I believe that we can all do that is through feeling. And so the entire book basically teaches us how to feel, and then we heal. And I call it the sit method. See it through. So it being the negatively charged belief. So when we sit with our stress, with any of our emotional pain and or physical pain, and we see it through to the other side, then the negative charge that was surrounding the story is no longer in charge of us. So, for example, the sit method what really was born out of excruciating pain for me. I dedicated my book to my 5-pound Yorkshire Terrier, Abby, because she is the love of my life and my soulmate. And it was her passing that brought the sit method into my life. So, for example, after she died, I went into such a state of grief and despair that I started waking up and going through the whole day being controlled by panic attacks. I was literally, and my husband would say, well, don't think negatively about, Abby's passing and just let it go. And I'd say to him, I'm not focusing on anything negative. These panic attacks are literally taking me over. I was asleep for the last hour, and then I would wake up in fight or flight, like complete panic. And this went on for 10 months, all day. And it was a good thing that we were in lockdown because I wasn't working. I would have never been able to leave the house. I couldn't leave the house. It was debilitating. And so one of those nights I got up, came downstairs, and I sat on my couch, and I thought to myself, I am so sick and tired of not being able to sleep. I am so exhausted. And then for some reason I thought, okay, write that down. And I wrote that down, and I said, what does that sound like? What does that feel like? And I remember, like, what does that sound like? And so I made this fake baby sound. And the second I did, it was like the lid popped off, and I just started wailing, like actual authentic baby, like childlike wails started pouring out of me. And I fully allowed myself to go with the feeling. I didn't stop and say, oh, okay, well, I better write that down. Oh, that's interesting. I just completely let myself feel the feelings, to the point where at the end of this sit, because it was the first sit ever born, I was on my side in the fetal position, rocking myself on my couch with tears all pooled in my eyes, and I was completely at peace. Now, that's when I understood that the feeling that came up, that I allow myself to fully feel in that moment, was now exhausted. And in between that time, me allowing myself to feel that feeling in that moment, what happened when I started crying like a child and like a baby is all of a sudden, within minutes, I was back in the crib. It was in the early 80s, because I was between 1 and 3 years old. I'm in the crib holding onto the bars, screaming bloody murder. And I was obviously experiencing a very traumatic, to me at that time, experience of not being picked up. Because I remember thinking in this memory, where is everybody? I'm all alone. I must be disgusting. Nobody wants to pick me up. I'm so cold that my skin hurts. My skin hurts. My skin hurts. I remember thinking. And when I was having that memory released, I allowed myself to fully feel those feelings as if I were there, even though they were in that moment with me in this time zone, because all time was now happening simultaneously. The past was no longer back behind me like it was something that I couldn't get to. It was alive and well in that moment. And it was alive and well in that moment because I let myself feel the feeling I was feeling today. And my brain gated an experience that had been tucked away from my memory before that now I was feeling through. And because I allowed myself to fully surrender into that feeling within, I don't know how many minutes, because I didn't time it, that's when I realized I was lying on my side. And so in this sit method, I explain how to exhaust a feeling. And that's essentially how you do it, by not trying to control the feeling, by not setting a timer on your phone, by not saying, oh, that's interesting, I better write that down because I might forget about it, because that's a condition. We place judgments on things. Oh, I better not cry this loud. That's too loud. That's a judgment. So what that will do is it will stunt the feeling. And if we block the feeling, we can't reintegrate it back in. If we can't reintegrate it back in, we can't transform the fact that it wants to get back in. We're just going to push it out further. And then it's going to come up in another situation and start to zap us and trigger us, which is the anxiety and the panic that I was feeling. And so after that, I literally went to bed after that. And it was the first time in 10 months that I slept for over 6 hours straight. Before that, I would sleep for like literally 20 minutes to 30 minutes each night. It was insane. And then slowly but surely after that, in the coming days, weeks, and months, I started to sit with everything that was bothering me. I would go to work, I'd feel rejected by something somebody said at work. I'd come home and I'd sit with rejection, and I'd allow myself to feel that moment, or feel all the feelings in that moment, which would then all of a sudden take me to other memories. And then I would feel those until the point where they were no longer in charge of me. And that information was no longer going to go out of my electromagnetic field and affect the quantum field for the environment to arrange more situations for me to feel triggered into those feelings of rejection or whatever it was that I was dealing with at that time. So my book, Soul Center, is essentially how to feel your feelings through, so that you really are peeling back old programming layers that are bombarding you and holding you down and back from experiencing and living your life optimally, and possibly even connecting with your own inner abilities that you didn't know that you had before. Like for me, those psychic abilities or whatever, just those knowings, the alignment to merge and connect with the whole of reality. And so the NDE experience, or the epiphany, as I call it, saved my life, because it saved my life and changed the entire trajectory of my life. And even though there are many ups and downs along the way, yes, it was the foundation that allowed me to remember that I am being supported, because I, within every ounce of my being, believed that I was with God in that moment. So no matter how low I felt throughout those years prior to going into writing my book or the work that I do with clients today, I had that in the back of my mind, that no matter how much I feel like I'm falling apart, I am being held together by this universal glue, this embodiment of unconditional love and support.